He's satisfying with himself when he said it. I could tell by the way he leaned back in the booth, one arm draped over the vinyl seat, his coffee untouched, because men like him don't drink diner coffee. They just hold it to have something to do with their hands while they ruin you. "You know what I told Brennan when he asked about you?" he said. "I told him the truth. I said you're a dishwasher. That's what you are now. That's what you'll always be." And he laughed, Karen. He laughed so hard he had to put his drink down. The restaurant was almost empty. Tuesday night in February, the kind of cold that keeps people home in Fort Bragg. Just two old men at the counter eating pie, and Manny in the back scraping the flat top. I was standing at the edge of the booth, holding a gray bus tub against my hip, and my hands were cracked from the sanitizer and the hot water, and my lower back had that deep ache it gets after 11 hours on your feet. I looked at him. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Because here's what Colonel Raymond Devereaux did not know, sitting there in that booth in his pressed civilian clothes with his Annapolis ring catching the fluorescent light. I had already filed. 3 days earlier, in a small office on Hay Street, with a lawyer named Dolores Achibe, who charged me $40 for the first consultation because I told her the truth, and the truth made her angry on my behalf. The papers were already moving through channels he didn't even know existed. And the name at the center of those papers, the name that would change everything, was not mine. It was his. My name is Karen Ellison. I'm 46 years old. I spent 9 years in federal prison for a crime I did not commit, and when I got out, I washed dishes at a diner called Rosie's near Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for $14 an hour, plus whatever Rosie felt like giving me from the tip jar on Fridays. This is the story of how a 2-star general walked into that diner on a rainy night in April, looked at me across the kitchen pass, and went so pale the hostess asked him if he needed to sit down. And how the words he whispered to his aide were heard by Manny, who was standing 3 feet away, pretending to refill the napkin dispensers. "My God," the general said. "It's her." But that comes later. First, you need to understand who I was before they took everything. I grew up in Sandhills, outside Southern Pines. My grandfather, Thomas Ellison, had a small house on a dirt road with a pecan tree in the front yard that dropped so many nuts in October you could hear them hitting the tin roof of the porch like slow rain. He raised me after my mother left. He'd been a staff sergeant in Vietnam, came home with a Purple Heart and a limp he never complained about, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like the only important thing in the room. He taught me to shoot when I was 9, taught me to read a topographic map when I was 11, taught me that silence was not weakness. That was his phrase, the one he said so often it became the wallpaper of my childhood. Always there, so familiar I stopped noticing it until much later when I needed it most. Silence is not weakness, Karen. Silence is where you keep your power until it's time. I enlisted at 18. Scored in the top 2% on the ASVAB. They offered me intelligence, and I took it. By 23, I was a signals intelligence analyst at Fort Bragg, holding a TS/SCI clearance, working in an SCIF where the air always smelled like burned coffee and cold metal. I was good at my job. Not good the way people say it casually. Good the way that mattered in rooms where one missed signal could mean a dead platoon. I could sit in front of intercept data for 14 hours and find the one anomaly, the one frequency shift, the one pattern that didn't belong. My supervising officer, a quiet major named Hendricks, once told me I had the best pattern recognition instinct he'd seen in 20 years. He wrote that in my evaluation. He signed it. That evaluation would later disappear from my personnel file as if it had never existed. I was also 5'4", 120 pounds, and I wore my hair in a regulation bun so tight it gave me headaches by noon. I had a small scar on my left temple from a car accident when I was 16, a half-moon shape that turned white in winter. I smiled easily. I laughed at Manny's jokes. People who met me at Rosie's, years later, covered in dish steam with my sleeves rolled up, never would have guessed that I once briefed a colonel on enemy communications networks in a room where everyone else had at least a decade more service than I did. They saw a quiet woman with tired eyes and rough hands. They saw what Raymond Devereaux wanted everyone to see: a dishwasher, a nobody, a woman who had already been erased. What they didn't see was the box under my bed in the studio apartment on Sycamore Street. A fireproof lockbox, the kind you buy at the hardware store for $40. Inside that box were 217 pages of documents, letters, hearing transcripts, and one sworn affidavit from a man who was dying of pancreatic cancer and had decided, after 16 years, that he was more afraid of God than he was of Raymond Devereaux. That box was my silence, and my silence was not weakness. My name is Claire Mousseau, and I need to tell you who I was before they unmade me. I grew up in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, in a house that leaned slightly to the left, as if the whole structure was tired of standing. My grandfather built it in 1961 with lumber he milled himself from black walnut trees on the back slope. The floors were uneven, the kitchen window didn't close all the way in summer. But it was ours, every warped inch of it, and my grandfather kept it the way he kept everything in his life, with patience, with silence, and with hands that never stopped working. His name was Everett Mousseau. He'd served in Korea, came home with a piece of Chinese shrapnel lodged 2 centimeters from his spine, and never mentioned it unless a doctor made him. He worked 31 years at the paper mill in Martinsburg, retired on a Friday, and spent Saturday morning rebuilding the porch railing because he said a man who stops using his hands starts dying from the fingers inward. He was not a warm man in the way people expect warmth. He didn't hug me often. He didn't say he loved me in those words. But every morning before I walked to school, he would stand at the kitchen door and say the same thing, the same 6 words. And I carry them now the way some people carry prayers. He would say, "You know what you're worth." Not a question, a statement. Like he was reminding me of something I had already proven. I was 9 years old when I first understood that he meant it not as encouragement, but as a warning. Because the world, he believed, would spend its entire energy trying to convince you otherwise. He was right. I joined the Army at 19, not because I wanted to fight, because I wanted structure, and because the recruiter at Shepherd University's career fair was honest with me, which was more than I could say for most adults at the time. He told me the work would be hard, the pay would be modest, and nobody would care how smart I was until I proved it under pressure. That sounded like home. I tested into signals intelligence. My scores in pattern recognition and linguistic analysis were high enough that they moved me from the regular pipeline into an accelerated track at Goodfellow Air Force Base in San Angelo, Texas, where I spent 11 months learning to listen to things most people would never hear. Encrypted transmissions, fragmented battlefield chatter, the tiny pauses between words where the real meaning hides. I was good at it, not because I was brilliant, though my instructors said I was, because I was patient, because I had spent my childhood in a quiet house with a quiet man, and I understood that silence has architecture. It has floors and walls. It has rooms you can walk through if you know where the doors are. By 23, I held a TS/SCI clearance and was stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland, working in a unit whose official name was so bland it could put you to sleep. Signals Analysis Support Element. We called it the basement because that's where our office was, and because nobody above ground wanted to know what we did until they needed it badly. I was 5'4", 118 pounds. Brown hair that I kept short because it was easier under a headset. A scar on my left wrist from a childhood accident with a hay rake. I did not look like someone who could disassemble a foreign government's communication relay architecture. I looked like someone you would ask to hold your coat. That was useful. In my 7 years of active service, I deployed 3 times, twice to Afghanistan, and once to a location I am still not permitted to name. During my second deployment, I identified a pattern in insurgent radio traffic that led to the interdiction of a weapons convoy in Helmand Province. 14 Marines came home from a patrol that would have killed them. I received a commendation letter from a brigadier general named Lyle Odom. The letter was 1 page. It said, in part, that my analysis demonstrated exceptional acuity and professional dedication of the highest order. I kept that letter in a folder. Later, when I needed it, it would be in the lockbox on Sycamore Street. But I want to tell you about my knee, because the knee is where Raymond Devereaux enters this story. During my 3rd deployment, I stepped wrong coming off a helicopter in a forward operating base. Torn meniscus, right knee. It sounds small. It was not small. The surgery was done at Landstuhl in Germany, and the recovery was supposed to take 8 weeks. It took 5 months because of an infection that nobody caught until my knee swelled to the size of a cantaloupe, and I couldn't walk to the latrine without holding the wall. I was medically separated, honorable discharge, full benefits, a handshake from my commanding officer who told me the unit wouldn't be the same without me. He was being kind. The unit replaced me in 11 days. I came home to West Virginia in October. The leaves were turning on the ridge above Harper's Ferry, red and gold against a sky so blue it looked painted. My grandfather was 81. He was slower. His hands shook when he poured coffee. But he was at the kitchen door when I pulled into the gravel drive, and he said the same 6 words he always said, and I sat in the car for a full minute after he went inside, because I did not want him to see me cry. That was the last autumn I had with him before everything changed. Before I met Raymond Devereaux at a Veterans Affairs office in Martinsburg, where he sat behind a desk with a brass nameplate and a smile that made you feel, for exactly 5 minutes, like someone in this country still gave a damn about you. He was the director of Veteran Services for the Eastern Panhandle region. He was 54, silver-haired, a former JAG officer who had never deployed but spoke about the military the way politicians do, with reverence that costs them nothing. He shook my hand with both of his. He called me a hero. He said he was going to make sure I got everything I deserved. That was the first true thing Raymond Devereaux ever said to me. He just didn't mean it the way I heard it. I believed him. That's the part that still stings. Not because I was stupid, but because I was tired. There's a difference. Stupid is walking into a trap you can see. Tired is knowing the ground looks wrong and stepping forward anyway because you've been walking so long your legs won't stop. Raymond courted me the way a man courts a woman he's already calculating the value of. He brought flowers to our second meeting at the VA office, which should have been about my disability claim. He told me my file was extraordinary. He said he'd never met anyone like me, and when he said it, he leaned across the desk and lowered his voice like he was sharing a secret. I was 31. I had been out of prison for 4 months. I had a felony on my record for something I did not do, a body that still woke up screaming at 2 a.m, and a grandfather who was the only person on earth who touched me without wanting something in return. Raymond Devereaux looked at all of that and saw opportunity. We were married within a year. Grandpa Henry didn't come to the ceremony. He said he had a doctor's appointment he couldn't move. I found out later he'd sat in his truck in the parking lot of the Shepherdstown courthouse the whole time, engine running, waiting to see if I'd walk out. He never said a bad word about Raymond. He just stopped finishing his sentences when Raymond's name came up. He'd start to say something, then look out the window, then say, "Well, you know what you're doing." I didn't. The first time Raymond took credit for something of mine, it was small enough to miss. I had written a proposal for a peer support program for female veterans in the region, women coming home to nothing, no services, no housing, no one who understood what they'd been through. I wrote it on our kitchen table in Martinsburg over 3 nights, while Raymond watched baseball in the next room. 14 pages, budget included, contact list for every women's shelter from Charlestown to Cumberland. I printed it and left it in a folder for him to review because he said he'd present it at the regional meeting in Morgantown. He presented it, under his name. I found out because a woman from the state office called the house to congratulate him. She said, "Your husband's proposal was the highlight of the meeting." She said they were going to fund it. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone, and I could hear Raymond's car pulling into the driveway, and I thought, he forgot to add my name. That's all. He forgot. I asked him about it that night. He was loosening his tie in the bedroom, that slow, deliberate way he had, like every motion was a performance. He said, "Ellie, come on. You know how these things work. My name carries weight in that office. Yours doesn't. Not yet." He said it so gently. He said, "I'm building something for both of us." That was the first time. The second time was the house. We bought a place outside of Shepherdstown, a 3-bedroom stone cottage on 2 acres with a creek running behind it. I put down the entire payment. $62,000, every cent of my military savings, plus back disability pay that had finally come through. Raymond handled the paperwork because he said he knew a title attorney who'd give us a deal. When I saw the deed 6 months later in a drawer I'd open looking for a stamp, only his name was on it. I held the paper and read it twice. I read it a third time. Then I put it back in the drawer and closed it, and went outside and stood by the creek until my hands stopped shaking. When I brought it up, he had an explanation. He always had an explanation. Something about tax advantages, something about my felony record complicating title transfers. He said he'd fix it. He said it with that same gentle voice, the one that made you feel like you were being unreasonable for asking. He never fixed it. The third time was public. We were at a Veterans Day dinner at the American Legion Post in Martinsburg, November 2019. Raymond was at the podium giving a speech about service and sacrifice. He was good at speeches. He had a way of pausing after certain words, letting them hang in the air like they meant something. He talked about the men and women who had given everything. He talked about his own years in the JAG Corps as though he'd been in the desert instead of an office in Alexandria. And then he told a story about a soldier who had saved 3 lives under fire in Kandahar, who had come home broken but unbowed, who represented the best of what this country produces. He told my story. He didn't use my name. He said, "A veteran I had the honor of helping through our program." He said it like I was a case file, like I was something he had fixed. I was sitting at table 6 with a paper plate of lukewarm brisket and a plastic cup of sweet tea. A woman next to me, someone's wife, leaned over and whispered, "Your husband is such a wonderful man." I smiled. I said, "Yes, he is." That night, I sat in our bathroom with the door locked and the fan running so he couldn't hear me, and I pressed a towel against my face and cried until my ribs hurt. I cried for the woman in Kandahar who had dragged Marcus Webb through the dust with one hand while firing with the other. I cried for the woman who had sat in a cell for 11 months for a crime she did not commit because the evidence had been mishandled and no one cared enough to look twice. I cried because my grandfather was getting thinner every month and I couldn't tell him the truth because the truth would break his heart, and his heart was the only good thing I had left. The fourth time was the worst because it was the quietest. Raymond came home one evening in March 2020, just before the world shut down, and told me he'd been offered a position with a defense consulting firm in Arlington. Good money. Real money. He said, "This changes everything for us, Ellie." He was excited the way a boy is excited, pacing the kitchen, gesturing with his hands. I asked him how he got the connection. He paused. Just half a second, but I'd been trained to notice pauses. He said a colleague had recommended him based on his understanding of veteran transition issues. I found the email chain a week later. He'd sent my service record, my commendations, my operational history to the firm's recruiter as a sample case study for his consulting pitch. He'd redacted my name, but left enough detail that anyone with a security clearance could identify me. He had used my classified service history to sell himself to a private company. I didn't confront him. Not that time. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd written that proposal 2 years earlier, and I looked at my hands, and I thought about what Grandpa Henry always said. Water doesn't fight the rock, Ellie girl. I was the water. I had been the water my whole life. But even water, given enough time, finds the crack. The crack came on a Tuesday in November. Not with a bang, not with a fight. It came with a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, and a 7-second pause before anyone spoke. The message was from a paralegal at the VA's Office of Inspector General. She said my name carefully, like she was reading it for the first time, and asked me to return the call at my earliest convenience regarding a matter related to my service file and its potential unauthorized disclosure. She left a case number. She thanked me for my service. The voicemail ended. I played it 3 times, sitting in the parking lot of the restaurant where I washed dishes. The engine was off. The windows were fogged from my breath. My hands smelled like industrial soap and the grease that never fully comes out from under your nails, no matter how hard you scrub. I played it a 4th time just to hear her say the words, unauthorized disclosure, because those 2 words confirmed something I had suspected for over a year, but hadn't been able to prove. Someone else had noticed what Marcus did with my file. I didn't call back that day. I drove home. I showered. I made a cup of tea with 2 sugars, the way Grandpa Henry used to make it, and I sat in the one good chair in my studio apartment in Falls Church, the one I'd found on the curb 2 blocks over and carried home myself because I couldn't afford a cab and didn't own a car that ran on anything but prayer. I sat there and I thought. For 3 years I had absorbed everything Marcus threw at me and everything the system threw at me after that. The proposal he took, the consulting credit he claimed, the classified service record he shopped around like a business card. And then the worst of it, the thing I haven't told you about yet, the part that put me in a cell for 11 months. He had reported irregularities in a joint account we shared during our marriage. Money I had moved to protect myself during the divorce. Money that was legally mine from my deployment savings. Money I had documentation for. But Marcus had friends. Marcus always had friends. A JAG officer he'd gone to law school with before switching to policy consulting. A forensic accountant who owed him a favor. They built a case that made my legal withdrawal look like misappropriation of jointly held funds with a federal nexus because of the account's connection to my military pay. The charge was a stretch. My public defender said so. The judge said so, privately, to the attorneys. But the evidence had been packaged so neatly, and my defender was so overworked, and I was so tired of fighting a man who turned every room into his stage, that I took the plea. 11 months at Alderson. Minimum security. I washed floors there too. When I came out, no one was waiting. My mother had died while I was inside. A stroke. Quick. In her kitchen in Fredericksburg. They told me 3 days after it happened. Marcus sent flowers to the funeral. White lilies. My aunt said he gave a beautiful speech about family. So when that voicemail arrived, I understood what it meant. Not just legally. I understood it the way you understand the first warm day after a long winter. Something had shifted. Somewhere, in some office, someone had pulled a thread, and the thread led back to Marcus and what he had done with my file. I called the paralegal back the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Her name was Diane. She was efficient and kind in the way that government employees sometimes are when they know the person on the other end of the line has been through something real. She explained that a routine audit of security clearance-related disclosures had flagged my service record appearing in a private consulting firm's internal documents. The firm had cooperated. They had provided the email chain. Marcus's name was on it. Diane asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint. I said yes. She asked if I had legal representation. I said no. She paused, and in that pause I heard something I hadn't heard in a long time. She said there are organizations that provide pro bono counsel for veterans in cases involving clearance violations. She gave me 3 names. She said she shouldn't recommend one over another, but that the second one on the list had recently won a significant case involving spousal misuse of service records. I wrote down the second name. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from anxiety, from clarity. It was the strangest feeling. Like putting on glasses after years of squinting. Every incident, every slight, every stolen credit and swallowed response arranged itself in my mind with a precision I recognized from mission planning. Target identification, asset inventory, timeline, contingencies. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I had expected to feel rage when this moment finally came. The moment when the door cracked open and I could see a way through. But rage wasn't what filled the space. What filled it was something quieter and much more dangerous. Certainty. I knew what I had. I knew what he'd done. I knew the law, because I'd spent 11 months in a prison library reading federal statutes the way some women read novels. And I knew something Marcus had never bothered to learn about me in 7 years of marriage. I don't quit. I go quiet. I go still. But I don't quit. Grandpa Henry knew it. He saw it when I was 9 years old, standing at the edge of the Rappahannock with a fishing line that hadn't moved in 4 hours. Every other kid had gone inside. I was still standing there, feet numb, eyes on the water. He came down with a blanket and draped it over my shoulders and said nothing for a long time. Then he said the thing I carry like a stone in my pocket. Water doesn't fight the rock, but the rock is the one that disappears. I picked up the phone and called the second name on Diane's list. A woman answered. I told her who I was. I told her what happened. She listened without interrupting for 22 minutes. When I finished, she said 4 words that changed everything. We can prove this. Her name was Patricia Vaughn. She worked out of a small office on Duke Street in Alexandria, 2nd floor above a dry cleaner. And the first time I walked in, I thought I had the wrong address. The carpet was stained. The waiting room had 2 plastic chairs and a ficus that was barely alive. But when Patricia sat down across from me and opened a yellow legal pad, I understood something immediately. This woman did not care about appearances. She cared about evidence. She had spent 11 years as a JAG officer before going into private practice. She knew military law the way I knew radio frequencies, which is to say she knew it in her sleep, in her bones, in the dark. And when I laid out the timeline of what had happened to me, when I told her about the convoy, about the investigation, about the court-martial, about the guilty plea I had signed because my appointed counsel told me it was the only way to keep the sentence under 3 years, Patricia did something no one had done. She went back to the beginning. Not my beginning. The investigation's beginning. She asked me questions I had never been asked. Who initiated the inquiry? Who assigned the investigating officer? Whether the convoy manifest had been entered into evidence or only referenced. Whether the communications logs from that night had been preserved or overwritten. I didn't know the answers to half of them. She said that was fine. She said the answers existed, whether I knew them or not. She said paper has a longer memory than people. For the next 4 months, I washed dishes at the Waffle House, and Patricia Vaughn built a case. I worked the closing shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, and I would come home smelling like grease and syrup and sit at the kitchen table in the apartment I was renting for $600 a month in Woodbridge, a 1-bedroom with a window that looked out onto the parking lot of a check cashing place, and I would read whatever Patricia had sent me. Photocopied documents, FOIA requests, correspondence logs, unit rosters. She found the first crack in December. The investigating officer who had handled my case, a captain named Royce, had been reassigned to a different installation 6 weeks after the court-martial. That by itself meant nothing, but Patricia pulled his subsequent assignments and found a pattern. Every unit Royce touched had an unusually high rate of administrative separations. He was a hatchet man, someone the chain of command used to clean up problems quickly and quietly. My case wasn't an anomaly. It was a template. The second crack came in January. Patricia obtained the communications logs from the convoy through a records request that took her 3 attempts and a formal complaint to the Army Records Management Office. The logs showed something I had always known but could never prove. The order to deviate from the planned route had come from the operations center, not from me. It was there, in black and white, time-stamped, with a call sign that belonged to Major Ellison, who had been the battalion operations officer. The same Major Ellison who had testified at my court-martial that no such order was given. The same Major Ellison who was now Lieutenant Colonel Ellison, stationed at the Pentagon. I remember the night Patricia called me about the logs. I was standing behind the dish pit at Waffle House, hands raw from the sanitizer solution, and my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. I stepped outside into the cold. January in Northern Virginia, that kind of cold that sits on your chest. She read me the relevant entry. She read me the timestamp. She read me Ellison's call sign. And I stood there in the parking lot under a sodium light with my breath coming out in clouds, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not joy, not triumph, just the ground becoming solid under my feet again. Just the feeling of standing on something real after years of standing on nothing. Patricia told me not to tell anyone. Not Diane, not Marcus at the Waffle House. Not the woman at my church who had been kind to me. She said the moment we showed our hand was the moment the machinery would start working against us again. She said we had 1 chance to do this right and 0 chances to do it twice. I understood. I had spent years in signals intelligence. I knew what operational security meant. I knew how to hold information close and move without drawing attention. So I kept washing dishes. I kept showing up at 7 in the morning with my hands cracked and my back sore, and I kept saying, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," and I kept my face perfectly still. The morning manager, a woman named Tina who was 23 and already exhausted by life, sometimes looked at me sideways. She told me once that I was the calmest person she had ever met. She said it like it was strange. I told her I just liked routine. What I did not tell her was that underneath my calm, there was a clock ticking. Patricia was filing motions. Patricia was building a record. Patricia was reaching out to 3 other soldiers who had been processed by Captain Royce, and whose cases showed similar irregularities. I did not tell anyone that on my days off, I drove to Alexandria and sat in Patricia's office for hours, going through documents page by page. I did not tell anyone that I had a folder growing thicker every week in the bottom drawer of my dresser, underneath my socks, a folder that contained the evidence of my own innocence. I did not tell anyone that sometimes at night after my shift, I would sit in my car in the parking lot and hold that folder on my lap and just breathe. Not reading it, just holding it. Feeling its weight, knowing it was real. Ellison got promoted again in March. I saw it in the Army Times online. There was a photo of him shaking hands with a 2-star general at a ceremony. He was smiling. Clean uniform, perfect teeth. I looked at that photo for a long time. I felt nothing personal toward him, nothing hot. Just a cold, clear understanding that this man had lied under oath about an order that cost people their lives and cost me my freedom, and he had been rewarded for it. And I understood that the system would not correct itself. The system would have to be shown. Patricia said we were almost ready. She said one more piece, one more name. She was looking for the radio operator who had been on duty at the operations center the night of the convoy, the one who would have heard the order go out, the one whose initials should be on the log. She had a name. She was trying to find him. I went back to the dish pit. I scrubbed plates. I said nothing to anyone. The radio operator's name was Staff Sergeant Dennis Pruitt, and Patricia found him living in a single-wide trailer outside Killeen, Texas, 3 miles from the Fort Cavazos gate. He had been medically retired in 2019, anxiety disorder. He answered the phone on the second ring, and when Patricia said the words convoy and Wardak Province and October 2017, he went silent for 11 seconds. She counted. Then he said, "I've been waiting for this call for 6 years." Pruitt had kept a personal copy of the radio log. He had kept it in a fireproof lockbox under his bed for 6 years because he knew what had happened, and he knew what the log showed, and he knew that someday someone would come asking. The log showed that Colonel Lawrence Braddock had issued a direct order at 22:14 hours to proceed along Route Tango, despite a report from the intelligence section flagging possible IED activity on that route. The log showed that I had requested permission to divert to Route Sequoia. The log showed that permission was denied. The log showed that Braddock had initialed the denial himself. That log had not been included in the investigation file. It had not been presented at my court-martial. The version in the official record had been altered. Pruitt's initials were missing from the official version. The timestamps had been changed. And when Pruitt had tried to raise this with the investigating officer in 2018, he had been told that his recollection was inconsistent with the evidence and that further inquiry would not be necessary. He understood what that meant. He shut his mouth. He went home. He stopped sleeping. Patricia filed the petition for a new hearing on a Tuesday in March. I remember because it was raining, and I was elbow-deep in a bus tub full of cold pasta water when she called me. She said the hearing had been scheduled for June 14th at the Army Court of Criminal Appeals in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. She said Colonel Braddock had been notified. She said his JAG lawyer had already filed a motion to dismiss. She said the motion had been denied. I took the Greyhound from Fort Worth to Washington. 31 hours. I wore the only suit I owned, which Patricia had bought me at a Goodwill in Arlington. Navy blue. It fit well enough. I had lost weight from the dish pit, so the shoulders were slightly loose, but Patricia said it didn't matter. She said what mattered was the fireproof lockbox. The courtroom at Fort Belvoir was small. Wood-paneled walls, a flag behind the bench. 3 judges sat up front, 2 men and 1 woman, all colonels. The room smelled like floor wax and old paper. There were maybe 20 people in the gallery. Patricia sat beside me at the petitioner's table. Pruitt sat in the front row of the gallery, holding a manila folder on his lap, with both hands like it was a child. Braddock sat on the other side of the aisle. I had not seen him in person in 6 years. He looked older. His hair was thinner. He wore his Class A uniform with all the ribbons and the star on each shoulder. Brigadier General Lawrence Braddock. He had been promoted the year after my conviction. He sat very straight, and he did not look at me. Not once. His lawyer was a full bird colonel from the JAG Corps who had a calm face and a leather briefcase that probably cost more than 3 months of my dish pit wages. The presiding judge opened the hearing at 900. Patricia presented the case methodically. She did not raise her voice. She introduced the original radio log. She introduced Pruitt's sworn affidavit. She introduced the altered version from the official investigation file, and she placed them side by side on the overhead projector so the 3 judges could see the differences, line by line. The timestamps, the missing initials, the deleted entry where I had requested diversion to Route Sequoia. Then she called Pruitt to the stand. He walked up slowly. He was sweating. His hands were shaking. But when he sat down and raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, he looked directly at the judges and his voice was steady. He said I was on duty that night. He said I heard the order. He said Captain Mercer requested a route change and was denied. He said Colonel Braddock issued the denial personally. He said he had kept the original log because he knew the official record had been falsified and he could not live with that. Braddock's lawyer objected. He said the document's chain of custody was compromised. He said Pruitt's mental health history made his testimony unreliable. He said this was a disgruntled former enlisted soldier with an axe to grind. The presiding judge listened. Then she asked Braddock's lawyer a single question. She said, "Can you explain why Staff Sergeant Pruitt's initials appear on this log, but not on the version submitted during the original court-martial?" The lawyer paused. He looked back at Braddock. Braddock's face had not changed expression, but I noticed something. His right hand, which had been resting on the table, had moved to his knee, and it was gripping the fabric of his trousers. Hard. The lawyer said he could not explain the discrepancy at this time. Patricia stood again. She said, "Your Honor, I would like to enter one additional exhibit." She opened her briefcase and removed a single sheet of paper. It was an email. It was from Colonel Braddock to the investigating officer, dated November 2017, 3 weeks after the convoy attack. It read, and I will never forget the words because I read them so many times that they burned into my memory. It read, "Recommend we streamline the radio log entries for clarity. Some of the timestamps may cause confusion during proceedings. Pruitt's involvement was minimal and does not need to be highlighted." The room was silent. I mean silent the way a room gets when air itself seems to stop. The judge on the left leaned forward. The judge on the right removed his glasses. The presiding judge looked at Braddock. She did not ask his lawyer. She looked directly at him. She said, "General Braddock, did you write this email?" He did not answer immediately. His lawyer started to speak, and Braddock raised one hand, just slightly, and the lawyer stopped. Braddock looked up. He looked at the judge, and then for the first time in 6 years, he looked at me. I have thought about that moment many times. What was in his eyes? It was not guilt, exactly. It was recognition. It was the face of a man who has been standing on a trapdoor for 6 years and has just heard the bolt slide. He looked at me and I saw the exact instant he understood that the woman in the Goodwill suit at the petitioner's table was not the woman he had buried under paperwork and prison time and silence. He went pale. Genuinely pale. The color left his face the way water leaves a drain, and he said very quietly, almost to himself, "My God." I did not react. I sat with my hands folded on the table. I looked back at him. I said nothing. The presiding judge asked again, "Did you write this email, General?" His lawyer objected. Braddock overruled his own lawyer. He said yes. The courtroom did not erupt. That is something people get wrong when they imagine these moments. There was no gasp, no dramatic murmur sweeping through the gallery. What happened was worse. What happened was silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your eardrums. Braddock's own attorney closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. I counted. Then he opened them and began writing something on his legal pad very quickly. The JAG prosecutor stood and asked permission to enter Exhibit 14 through 22 into the record. The judge nodded. And one by one, the documents I had spent 3 years assembling were read into the official transcript of a federal courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia. The email Braddock admitted to writing was from March of 2017. In it, he instructed Colonel Voss to reclassify my operational report on the Kandahar logistics anomalies as containing procedural errors. The phrase he used was, "Clean this up before it reaches the IG," the Inspector General. Because my report documented a discrepancy of $4.2 million in contractor payments that ran through a program Braddock had personally endorsed. He did not steal that money. I want to be clear about that. He was not a thief in the simple sense. He was something more common and in some ways more dangerous. He was a man who had approved something without reading it carefully, who had trusted people he should not have trusted, and who, when confronted with the possibility that his name was attached to a failure, chose to destroy the person who found the failure rather than face it. That person was me. The judge reviewed each document, my original report, the reclassification order, the internal memo recommending my transfer, the falsified counseling statement that appeared in my file 3 weeks before my court-martial. The testimony of Master Sergeant Aldine, given by deposition because she was stationed in Ramstein, confirming that she had witnessed Colonel Voss instruct a junior officer to alter the date on that counseling statement. And the email that connected all of it to Braddock directly. His attorney requested a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, I stayed at the petitioner's table. I drank water from a paper cup. My hands were steady. Ruth Okonkwo sat beside me and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Across the aisle, Braddock sat with his head slightly bowed and his attorney speaking rapidly into his ear. I watched his hands. They were shaking. Not dramatically, just a fine tremor in the fingers, like a man holding something too heavy for too long. When the court reconvened, Braddock's attorney made a statement. He said that his client wished to express that certain administrative decisions made during the relevant period may have reflected institutional pressures rather than personal animus toward the petitioner. The judge looked at him over her glasses. She said, "Counselor, I have 22 exhibits in front of me. I am not interested in institutional pressures. I am interested in whether your client knowingly initiated or facilitated retaliatory action against a subordinate who filed a legitimate report. Do you understand the question?" He said, "Yes, Your Honor." She said, "Good." The hearing continued for another 90 minutes. During that time, the JAG prosecutor walked through the timeline month by month. He showed how my report was filed in February 2017, how by April my security clearance review had been flagged, how by June I had been transferred from my unit, how by September the counseling statement appeared, how by December I was facing charges of mishandling classified material, charges built entirely on the reclassified version of my own report. a version I had never seen and never signed. How I was convicted in March 2018 and sentenced to 18 months. How I served 14 months at the Naval Consolidated Brig in Chesapeake. How I was discharged. How I lost my clearance, my benefits, my pension eligibility, my career, and approximately 6 years of my life. The prosecutor did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. The documents did everything. At the end of the hearing, the judge said she would issue her ruling within 30 days. She looked at me, and she said something I did not expect. She said, "Sergeant Vasquez, I want you to know that this court takes seriously what has been presented here today." That was all. But the way she said it, the way she held my eyes when she said it. I nodded. I said, "Thank you, Your Honor." Outside the courthouse, Ruth Okonkwo and I stood on the steps in the November air. It was cold. That sharp Virginia cold that comes off the Potomac and finds every gap in your coat. She looked at me and she said, "Well." I said, "Well." And then she did something she had never done in 2 years of professional interaction. She hugged me. Brief and firm, the way you hold someone who has been carrying something impossibly heavy and has just set it down. 31 days later, the ruling came. Full reversal of my court-martial conviction. Formal finding of retaliatory action by a superior officer. Recommendation for restoration of rank and benefits, pending Department of Defense review. The judge wrote 11 pages. On page 9, she used the phrase, "systematic and deliberate suppression of a legitimate whistleblower report." On page 10, she wrote that the petitioner endured consequences that no service member should face for fulfilling their duty. Braddock was not criminally charged. That was a separate process, and it moved slowly. But within 6 weeks of the ruling, he was placed on administrative leave, pending an Inspector General investigation. Colonel Voss, who had retired in 2019, was recalled for deposition. The junior officer who altered the counseling statement cooperated fully and received immunity. My phone began ringing. People I had not heard from in years. Fellow soldiers who had served with me. Some of them apologized. Some of them said they had always known something was wrong. I did not ask them where they had been when I was washing dishes at 11 o'clock at night with my hands cracked and bleeding. My sister Claudia called. She cried for 10 minutes before she could speak. Then she said, "Elena, I am so sorry. I did not fight harder for you." I said, "Claudia, you wrote to me every week I was inside." She said, "I should have done more." I said, "You did what you could." We were both quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mama would have burned that courthouse down." And I laughed. For the first time in months, I laughed, and it sounded real. One call I did not receive was from Braddock. He did not apologize. He did not reach out through his attorney. He said nothing publicly. I learned later from Ruth that his position was that he had acted within his authority and that any errors were the result of subordinates exceeding their instructions. The emails contradicted this entirely. But that was his position, and he held it the way a man holds a shield over his head while the roof comes down. I think about Sergeant Major Dominguez often. More often than I expected I would. Not every day, but close to it. He died 14 months before I got out of Leavenworth. Pancreatic cancer. Claudia told me in a letter she wrote on yellow legal paper because she had run out of stationery. She wrote it simply, "Elena, he is gone. He went on a Tuesday morning. The sun was out. His daughter was holding his hand." I did not cry when I read it. I sat on my bunk, and I held the letter against my chest and I breathed. That was all I could do. In prison, you learn to grieve without sound. because sound invites questions, and questions invite attention, and attention invites trouble. So I grieved him silently in a concrete room, and I thought about the last thing he ever said to me in person. It was at Fort Hood. I was 29. I had just been passed over for a position I had earned, and everyone knew I had earned it, and no one had said a word. I was sitting on a bench outside the motor pool, staring at nothing, and Dominguez walked up and sat down next to me. He did not ask me what was wrong. He did not tell me it would be okay. He said, "Elena, the people who underestimate you are giving you the only advantage that matters." And then he said something I did not fully understand until I was standing in that courthouse lobby in Killeen with Claudia laughing about our mother burning things down. He said, "Do not spend your anger. Invest it." I thought it was just a tough guy line, a thing senior NCOs say to junior soldiers to keep them focused. But he meant it literally. He meant that anger is capital, that most people spend it the moment they feel it and it buys them nothing. A shouting match, a slammed door, a resignation letter written at 2 a.m. Gone. Vapor. But if you hold it and you let it sit and you let it accumulate interest over years, then when you finally deploy it, the return is extraordinary. I invested mine for 11 years. 4 in uniform watching Braddock take credit for work I had done. 2.5 in a courtroom where a military judge would not look me in the eye. 4.5 in Leavenworth washing trays and mopping floors and reading law by flashlight. And then 8 months at Rosalinda's, scrubbing carbon off sheet pans and saying "yes ma'am" and "no sir" and keeping my head down while the pressure built behind my sternum like water behind a dam. Dominguez would have understood the Killeen hearing, not the legal strategy. He was not a legal mind. But he would have understood the silence, the way I sat in that chair and let the evidence speak. The way I did not raise my voice when Braddock's name was read into the record. The way I watched Captain Torres go pale without saying a single word to him. Dominguez would have leaned over and said, "Good." Just like that. Good. I wish he had been there. I wish he had seen it. That is the honest, selfish truth of it. Not because I needed validation, but because he was the first person in my adult life who looked at me and saw something other than a quiet woman who could be moved aside. He saw the quiet, and he understood what lived underneath it. And he never once told me to be louder. He told me to be patient. There is a difference that most people never learn. Now I sit with that phrase and I turn it over like a stone in my hand. Do not spend your anger. Invest it. And I realize he was not just talking about career strategy or military politics. He was talking about a way of being in the world, a way of absorbing injury without letting it dissolve you, a way of taking every slight and every lie and every locked door and converting it into something structural, something load-bearing, something that holds weight when the moment finally comes. I will be honest with you. I held on too long. There were moments I should have spoken up before the court-martial. There were moments I should have walked into Braddock's office and put the evidence on his desk and said, "Choose." I did not do that because I believed in the system, and the system did not believe in me. And by the time I understood that asymmetry, it was too late. I was already in handcuffs. I was already on a bus to Kansas with my wrists zip-tied and a guard who would not tell me what time it was. If I could go back, I would not change everything. But I would change some things. I would have made copies of the supply records earlier. I would have contacted CID myself instead of waiting for Braddock to do the right thing. I would have trusted my instincts the night I saw the discrepancy in the shipping manifests and felt the hair rise on the back of my neck and thought something is very wrong here. I knew. My body knew before my mind did. and I waited because I wanted to believe that a man I respected would not let me take the fall for something he authorized. That is not weakness. Or maybe it is. Maybe trust is always a kind of weakness when it is given to someone who has not earned it. But I do not think Dominguez would call it weakness. I think he would call it the cost of being decent in a system that does not always reward decency. And I think he would say the cost was too high, and he would be right, and I would agree with him, and we would sit in silence for a while, because that was how we communicated best. In the spaces between words where the real meaning lived. I am not the same person I was before Leavenworth. I am harder in some places and softer in others. I can read a room in 4 seconds. I can tell when someone is lying by the way they hold their coffee cup. I can stand in a commercial kitchen for 11 hours without complaint, because I have stood in worse places for longer. But I also cry more easily now. Not in public, never in public. But alone in my apartment at night when the building is quiet and the only sound is the AC unit cycling on and off, I will sometimes sit on the edge of my bed and let it come. Not for what they did to me, for what I lost while they were doing it. Years, relationships, the version of myself that believed the world was basically fair. That version is gone, and she is not coming back, and some nights I mourn her like a death. Dominguez once told me that the strongest people he knew were not the ones who never broke. They were the ones who broke and then stood up and did not pretend it had not happened. I broke. I am not pretending, but I am standing. It is a Tuesday evening in late October, and I am sitting on the back steps of my apartment building in El Paso. The sun went down 20 minutes ago, and the sky is that color it gets here that you do not see anywhere else on Earth. Not purple exactly, not orange. Something in between that has no name and lasts about 8 minutes before the dark comes in from the east like a curtain being drawn. The Franklin Mountains are just shapes now, black cutouts against whatever is left of the light. There is a smell of creosote and cooling asphalt, and somewhere in the complex someone is grilling carne asada, and the smoke drifts across the parking lot in thin blue threads. I have a glass of water. Not wine, not beer, just water with ice, because it was 96 degrees today, and even now at dusk the concrete is warm under my bare feet. I am 41 years old. I have a felony on my record that will follow me for the rest of my life. I have $214,000 in a savings account that I earned by standing in front of people who wanted to erase me and refusing to disappear. I have a job washing dishes that I do not love and do not hate. I have an attorney who still checks in once a month, even though the case is closed, because she says she worries about me, and I believe her. I have a sister who calls on Sundays now. We do not talk about what happened. We talk about her daughter's soccer games, and whether it is going to rain, and what she is making for dinner. These are small things. They are not small to me. I think about Dominguez almost every day. Not in a sad way anymore. In the way you think about someone who handed you something important at the exact moment you needed it and did not ask for anything back. He told me once, sitting in that workshop with sawdust on his boots and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, that dignity is not something anyone can give you. He said people will try to give it to you like a gift, and they will try to take it away like a punishment, and both of those things are lies. He said dignity is a decision you make every single morning when you put your feet on the floor and face whatever is waiting. He said it quietly, like it was not a big statement. Like it was just obvious. I did not understand it then. I was 23, and I thought dignity was something you earned through rank and performance evaluations and service records. I thought it was external, something pinned to your chest. I understand it now. It is a decision I make every morning when I put my feet on the floor in an apartment that smells like dish soap and the lavender plant I keep on the windowsill that refuses to die no matter how much I neglect it. It is a decision I make when I walk into that kitchen and tie on the apron and turn on the water and start. Not because the work is noble, not because I have something to prove, because I am here, because I survived. Because surviving is not a passive thing. It is something you do with your hands and your spine, and the stubborn animal refusal to let someone else's cruelty be the last word in your story. General Whitfield retired 6 months after the hearing. There was no ceremony that I know of, no parade. He just stopped being a general and started being a man in his 60s with a pension and a record that now includes a congressional reprimand and an inspector general finding that uses the word systemic 4 times in 11 pages. I do not know what he does with his days. I do not think about it often. When I do think about it, I feel something that is not satisfaction and not anger and not pity. It is closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of having carried someone else's failure for 15 years and finally setting it down and feeling how tired your arms actually are. The sky is almost dark now. A few stars are showing up. Somewhere a dog is barking in short, rhythmic bursts like it is trying to make a point. The ice in my glass has melted and the water is warm, and I drink it anyway because water is water and thirst is thirst, and not everything needs to be perfect to be enough. I want to say something to you. Not advice. I do not give advice. I do not know your life or your situation or what you are carrying or how long you have been carrying it. But I know what it feels like to be in a room where everyone has decided who you are and none of them are right. I know what it feels like to be quiet so long that you start to wonder if your voice still works. It works. It still works. I know because I wondered the same thing, and then one day in a courtroom in Washington, I opened my mouth and everything I had been holding came out steady and clear and true, and it filled that room like water filling a glass. Not because I was brave, because I was done. If you are not done yet, that is fine. You will know when you are. It is not a decision you make with your head. It is something that happens in your chest. One day the weight shifts and you feel it, and after that you cannot unfeel it. You cannot go back to pretending it is not there. My name is Elena Vargas. I served. I was convicted. I was erased. I came back, not as someone new, as myself, the same person I have always been, just quieter now, and sure of fewer things. And sure of those fewer things, absolutely. The last star comes out over the mountains, and I sit there with my warm water and my bare feet on the concrete, and I do not move for a long time. There is nowhere I need to be. There is no one I need to convince. The night comes in, and it is wide and dark and full of nothing in particular, and that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.